Welcome back to Global Studies with Miss Pritchard. This is Global 2, Vocab number 2. This time the topic is the scientific revolution and Enlightenment. Remember, you have two ways to do your vocab, either flashcards or writing them in your notebook. Whichever one you did for the first round of words, you should do for the second round of words. You want to keep this system going so all your vocabulary is one place so that studying for the exam is easier. Because remember, you have to pass the Regents to graduate. All right, here we go. The scientific revolution. This is the 16th and 17th century in Europe. This is when new discoveries and ideas changed daily life in Europe. Keep in mind, in the Islamic empires and in China, they already knew a lot of this stuff, or at least accepted it. But in Europe, it was brand new, and it completely changed the way people lived and the way they viewed the world. First off, the geocentric theory. That was the belief that the Earth was the center of the universe, and the Catholic Church stuck with that story for centuries, even after it was proven wrong. The heliocentric theory, which is the correct one, is the belief that the sun is the center of the solar system. And let's get into the people who talked about that and proved it. All right, first, there's Nicholas Copernicus. He was a Polish cleric and astronomer that developed the heliocentric theory. He watched the sky and the sun, and he realized that the sun was not revolving around the earth, but the earth was revolving around the sun. Next, we have Tycho Brahe. He is a Danish astronomer that began the work to prove the heliocentric theory. And then we have Johann Kepler, who is a Danish mathematician, and ultimately he is the one that proves it. He also proves that all of the planets and the different bodies, they do not orbit in perfectly circular patterns, but in ellipses. They are ovals. So there's the importance of math right there. You use math to prove many scientific things. Probably the most famous person in all of this is Galileo Galilei, and he is an Italian scientist that continued to develop and prove the heliocentric theory. He is tried and convicted of heresy by the Catholic Church for his work, and he lives the last 9 years of his life in his house under house arrest, and it takes the Catholic Church almost 500 years to admit that they were wrong, because they did not say, oh yeah, he was right, until 1992. I'd like to point out that's after I graduated from high school, and I was born centuries after Galileo. All right, philosophy. The new scientific thinking changed the way people viewed the world and the way they thought about everyday things. The first part of that being the scientific method. That is a procedure for developing and proving or disproving an idea. You go over the scientific method every year in science. You use it in earth science, you use it in living environment, in chemistry, in physics. If you are taking any science class, you are using the scientific method. Francis Bacon, he was an English politician and writer who developed and encouraged empiricism. And I am going to tell you that I agree that everything is better with Bacon, because he is the one who said you have to prove things, you have to have facts and evidence to support your ideas. That's what is called empiricism. So remember, everything's better with Bacon because there's evidence. All right, René Descartes. He is a French mathematician and philosopher. He developed analytical geometry, relied on logic and math to prove theories, and his famous quote is, "I think, therefore I am." Isaac Newton, he is an English scientist and mathematician, and he is the person we can thank for modern physics. He developed the laws of motion and gravity. All right, once you get the scientific revolution, it's not long before all of that trickles into government, and that is where we get the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is also known as the Age of Reason, and this is the time when belief in reason, thought, and individual problem solving developed in 18th century Europe. So instead of having to have a king or a nobleman tell you what to do, you're smart enough to figure it out for yourself. All right, we have a few philosophers. One is against, most of them are for it. Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher who believed people were naturally evil and they needed a strong ruler. He was a philosopher who believed in absolute divine right monarchy because he thought if people left on their own, they would do bad things. They would rob each other, they would kill each other, and do all sorts of horrible things. All right, so you need a king to enforce the social contract. That is the agreement between the government and the governed. The government agrees to protect, the governed agree to follow the rules, and usually pay taxes. John Locke, he is an English philosopher, and you can think of him as the opposite of Thomas Hobbes. He is a supporter of the natural rights of man, and he believes that people are naturally good. The natural rights of man, there are three of them: life, liberty, and property. All right, in France, the Enlightenment was a huge deal. In fact, they even had their own little group of people called the philosophes. Please spell that correctly when you're writing it. It's philosophe. And they are philosophers and social critics. Think of them as the Stephen Colberts and Jon Stewarts of their day. One of the most famous ones is Voltaire. He is a rather outspoken supporter of free thought and expression, and he is a writer. He ends up in prison for insulting the king, which leads him to believe that freedom of thought and freedom of expression are pretty important. And he ultimately moves to Vienna to get away from the French king and lives rather happily. All right, the Baron de Montesquieu, he is another French philosopher, and he believed in the separation of powers between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. Rousseau is another French philosopher, and he believed that the government only ruled with the consent of the people. In other words, direct democracy is the best. All right, other 18th century words you need to know. Enlightened despot, that is an absolute ruler that makes reforms based on the new ideas. In other words, give the people a little bit of freedom and maybe you can keep your throne. Neoclassical, this generally refers to architecture and decorating. It is the main style of the late 18th century, and it borrows heavily from the Greeks and the Romans. In fact, most of our government buildings in Washington, D.C. are built in the neoclassical style. Baroque, that is the opposite of neoclassical. It is the style of the 15th and 16th century, and it's very ornate and heavy. Lots of swirls and cupids and things like that in it. Salons, these were Paris social gatherings held to discuss the new ideas and discoveries of the Enlightenment. Think of it much like book groups today, or coffee houses, or barbershops, anywhere where people get together and they talk about current events or new ideas. That's what a salon was back in France. All right, and another idea you need to know for all of global studies is cultural diffusion, the spread of ideas, customs, or goods from one culture to another. The ideas of the Enlightenment spread throughout the world, and in fact, in the last couple of years, we've seen how they're attempting to spread democracy or bring democracy to the Middle East with the Arab Spring. That's why we have the Syrian civil war and other problems going on in that part of the world. All right, make sure you have images either in your notebook or on your flashcards. And I want to see all of the words, not just the second ones.